Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Top Tips for Fundraising During COVID-19 and Beyond. Thank you for taking time out your day to join us. I'm Michael Angel, the Church Operations Director at Ecclesiastical, and I'd like to welcome you to this, our first church fundraising webinar. Ecclesiastical has over 130 years' experience of insurance churches. Our specialist church team is always looking for ways to support you and your church, and we hope this will be one of the most successful. We understand that now more than ever, there is an immediate need for you to fundraise and to continue to fundraise to help you with the day-to-day needs of your church and community. We have been working on a range of resources to support you in this, and we now can announce that many of these can be found on our fundraising hub, www.ecclesiastical.com/church fundraising. Whatever level of fundraising experience or knowledge you have, we hope this webinar is useful and insightful and will help you begin or further develop that essential fundraising you are needing to do during these challenging times. This webinar is presented in collaboration with fundraising specialist Philanthropy Company. Established 18 years ago, Philanthropy Company has worked with many churches, charities and organisations, many in the non-profit sector. I'm pleased to announce that today's speaker is Caroline Underwood OBE, the CEO of Philanthropy Company. Caroline is a senior leader and an expert in fundraising and philanthropy with over 30 years' experience and has worked with many chiefs of industry, philanthropists, government leaders, as well as her local churches in Oxfordshire. Before I hand over to Caroline, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. All our advice in the webinar is applicable at the time of recording. As I'm sure you'll understand, due to the unusual circumstances we find ourselves in, we cannot guarantee all statements made will remain correct. We have tried our best to make sure the content will remain relevant for your church now and in the future as communities come back together. At the end of the session, there'll be a time for you to ask Caroline any questions you may have, and I'd very much encourage you to do this and have the opportunity to ask a fundraising expert. And if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll be uploading the on-demand recording to our fundraising hub so you can watch it back at any time. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Caroline Underwood OBE, CEO, Philanthropy Company.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about fundraising for churches during COVID-19. Even as we make this film, we are beginning to ease out of lockdown, and we know that things will start to change. But fundraising is still going to be challenging times, and we're not seeing people in the way that we used to. So this presentation is about things that you can do to continue fundraising during COVID-19. What we're going to cover in this webinar is 3 crucial questions. With social distancing in place, how can we fundraise? How do we keep our donors involved and up to date? And how can we replace funds that we might usually raise through face-to-face events, through congregation giving, through charity events, through garden parties and so on? What can we do instead? But before I dive into that, I wanted just to talk to you about some of the key terms that are used in fundraising, some of the key words, because knowing these words will help you with funders and will strengthen your applications in asking for money, both from those you know and from those you don't know. So let's look at those in detail. Some of these key terms are self-explanatory, and some of them you'll come across before in other work contexts, such as marketing. But let me run through them for you. The first, a capital campaign, as you might expect, that refers to anything to do with a bricks and mortar or a building project. This might be to renovate the church, it might be to do something associated with the church, such as fixing a path to enable disabled access, or even installing a loo for the congregation to use. But anything to do with capital campaign is about the building. You'll also see funders using the words matching grant or match funding. And this is where, as it implies, a donor will give you funds if you have managed to raise funds from elsewhere. So typically this might mean somebody saying, what can you raise from your own community before we give you a grant? Another term that is used very frequently and is worth knowing about is restricted gifts or restricted funds. This refers to donations for a very particular purpose or project. So for example, you might have somebody who's passionate about the windows in your church, and they might give you £500 towards the windows. That must be used towards the windows, not only ethically, but also responsibly. You need to report back on how those funds are used only for the windows and not for other purposes, unless you discuss that with the donor. Conversely, unrestricted giving is where a donation can be used at your discretion, so used towards your general cause or the core costs of your overall service you provide. The other term you'll hear all the time, and in fact we use in this presentation, is prospect, which is a rather basic way of referring to a potential funder. And that potential funder might be a charitable trust, an individual, a company, or some other kind of organisation that will potentially support your church or project. Core costs or revenue refer to programme funding or project funding. Now, so for example, that might be just running your ongoing costs, like keeping the lights on, or it might be funding something to do with a particular project, such as producing some materials, education materials, for example. Revenue or core costs refers to project funding. And then I want to turn to two very important but sometimes confusing terms, output and outcome. Why are these important? Because these are words that funders use. And if you're putting in applications, funders may ask for you to quantify and then report against these two words. So as we explain in these slides, output essentially is activities or materials which enable you to reach and support people. For example, you might be helping run a food bank. You might be producing materials for youngsters who are at home. And those are outputs, things that you are doing, activities or materials, as opposed to an outcome. And an outcome is what you're seeking to change or achieve. Think of it as an impact. So as a result of providing those meals or producing materials for youngsters, people don't go hungry, and young people are able to actually have something to keep them engaged during lockdown and extended lockdown. So output and outcome, two important words to be aware of. So let's turn then to how you can fundraise, even when you can't meet or groups can't meet, and there can't be the usual sorts of summer activities that some of us know so well, such as church fundraisers and activities in gardens and indeed in churchyards. I'm going to talk about three important elements to fundraising. Firstly, making sure you have a strong case for support, and I will explain what that is. Secondly, thinking about what you do in your community and considering new projects that could benefit your community. And thirdly, how could you work in partnership with others? How would that benefit your fundraising? So let's look first at a case for support. What is a case for support? Put simply, it's a story. It's a story about you and what you're trying to achieve. Sometimes I refer to it as setting out your stall. It's essentially using a powerful story to talk about why what you're doing is important, what impacts it will have, what benefits and changes your project will have. When you think about giving, people give both with their heads and with their hearts. So people are interested in facts and figures and rationale, but also don't be afraid to include the emotional aspects of your program or project. For some ideas about cases for support, take a look at some of the big national charities that we all know. They all use powerful cases for support, and then they mix up facts and figures with emotional and human interest stories. And there are some lessons to be learned from that for churches as well. As I'm making this film, we're actually just beginning to ease out of lockdown, but we do think that social distancing will be in place for some time. So with social distancing in place, how can we fundraise? First point is to make sure you've got that story, make sure you've got that case for support. And how do you write that? You write that by saying what the need is, what the solution is, what the outcome will be. The need, solution, and the outcome form the basis of your story, your case for support. Articulating the need is important, but also you will see, once you start to look around you, you'll see lots of people doing this, lots of charities, other churches, lots of people setting out their need. And it's very important to be clear about why your project or service is needed by the people that benefit from it. We're sharing here a page from the Campaign to End Loneliness report, which sets out their key need data. For example, 2 in 3 people know someone who is lonely. I completely appreciate you might not have access to much data, but if you're able to provide some basic facts about the need in your area, you're more likely to convince the potential funders. So to give you an example, you could say, in my village, 30% of the population are over 75. Or you could say, we know that food banks are operating in our community because there's a high number of children who qualify for free school meals. The more data, the more evidence you can provide, the stronger your case. It is important to be positive in conveying your message and conveying your case for support. This is not about, if you don't give us money now, the roof will fall in. It's about talking about the future, being positive, and absolutely encouraging people to support your cause. Do remember, you don't get a second go with lots of funders. It's very important to make a good first impression. And that positivity, that determination will absolutely come through across all your written materials and indeed how you speak to people. So still thinking about social distancing, still thinking about the extraordinary times we live in, but turning to think about possible projects that you're doing that support your community. I'm sure that many of you are already doing a number of these things, but it is important to articulate them and to perhaps think about them as programs. And indeed, many of these will run on post-lockdown as we move into whatever the new normal is going to be. We've given some examples here on this slide, but it might be that you have a number of projects that you're doing that you just need to write up and articulate for potential funders. One of the things that over the years that I've noticed that funders really respond to is where people have joined up with others to make a stronger project. And this particularly applies to churches as well. Are there local charities that you could work with? Perhaps you're involved in the local food bank and the food distribution. If you can explain that to funders, explain that you're working with others, whether with charities, whether with the local school, even some multi-faith projects, this is a more powerful proposition for funders to think about. Funders like to see people working in collaboration. They hate to see duplication of effort. And actually it makes for a stronger proposition, a stronger case for support for funders. So do think about that and tell that story as well. So let's turn then to thinking about how on earth you keep people up to date with what you're doing when perhaps you're not seeing them in the same way as you were before. What can you do to keep your donors involved and up to date? Well, telling people that you're still fundraising is the first step. There's been a sense, I think, that we've all gone into a quieter phase, not seeing each other, lockdown, social isolation. There's been an element that fundraising has not continued, but it has. And you need to make it clear that your need is still great. Keep up communications with potential donors and your past donors is critically important. And one of the things that you can do is to make sure that people who have already given articulate why they think your project is important, why they're giving to you, and perhaps encourage others to give. Take every opportunity to keep your donors up to date. And there are a few ideas I'm going to run through to do that. Many of these are frankly common sense, but sometimes it's useful to have them set out for you so that you can see them clearly in front of you. One thing that you can do is make it clear in the general public that you're continuing to fundraise, perhaps through a poster in your church or on the local notice board, certainly on your website, and make sure that anything about your fundraising is in your newsletters and other communications. We've actually developed a poster for you, a downloadable poster for you, which is available through the Ecclesiastical Church Fundraising Hub. I do hope you'll look at that hub because there's some really useful materials and tips on there. And as I say, a downloadable poster that you can use straight away. You can use on your notice board or indeed on your church building. What are the other things you can do to keep your donors involved and up to date? Well, obviously email is important, and you can email people a special crisis update e-newsletter. You can write to them by post in a good old-fashioned letter, dropping that through their letterbox or indeed using the post. And one of the most powerful ways, which in these email world a lot of people forget, is to phone somebody and just update them on what's going on. Talk to them about what you're planning to do. Talk to them about what you've achieved to date. I mentioned before asking some of your existing donors to perhaps be public supporters or indeed lead donors. You can ask people to put together a working group or to lead a fundraising committee. There's nothing like the passion of having given yourself to encourage others to give. And their giving makes people think, oh, maybe I should do that. Or that's interesting that he or she is giving. I'd like to be a part of that community as well. So do ask people who've already self-selected by giving to encourage others. How can we actually raise funds? Absolutely understand about involving donors, about articulating our story, but what can we do to raise funds right now? Many of you might be thinking we used to raise funds from collections or from room hire or from events. What can we do right now when we can't actually do many of those things? Well, I'm going to give you a few tips about how to do that. And don't forget to have a look at the Ecclesiastical Fundraising Hub, which all these tips are on there as well. The first thing that you can do is consider digital fundraising, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the second thing that you can do is really think about some of the incredibly generous funders that are out there that will fund your project. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. So digital fundraising and crowdfunding. I'm sure everybody will have experienced some of this. And of course, in this world where we've all moved online, we're all using Zoom all the time, or other ways of communicating, and everything has become digital. This is an important part of it as well. There are lots of fun ways to create online or digital events. You can have quizzes, you can have baking prizes, you can have hat making competitions. In a way, think about things that you used to do in your church community, just moving online. And there are many websites and giving platforms that exist, some of which we've listed here, that will help guide you through the process. If you don't know how to do it yourself, this is a fantastic way to get new people involved in the church by asking them about how to set up these crowdfunding platforms. They will be familiar with it. Crowdfunding is a part of most people's lives, and it's very easy to set up. So do have a think about this and think about how to make activities you perhaps used to do face-to-face go online. And then grants. Grants are an important part of any fundraising campaign, and there is a real opportunity to secure grants even during COVID-19. One of the things that's critically important to do is to have a look at which grants will support you, to think about them, to work out a plan for approaching them, and to do your application. I'm going to walk you through some of those opportunities. And let me just say that there are a number of emergency COVID-19 funding opportunities from grant funders, trusts and foundations, and a comprehensive list of them is available on the Fundraising Hub. These emergency funders have a shorter turnaround and less onerous application process, but it is important to, again, make sure they're applicable to you so that you don't waste your and their time. It is really important to do your research properly. There are around 8,500 trusts and foundations in the UK, and although researching them is time consuming, it will pay off. There are some really helpful online database websites where you can do your research. Some are free, like the Heritage Funding Directory, and some charge a license user fee like Funds Online by the Director of Social Change, but I believe some dioceses have subscriptions that you might be able to use to others, such as Funds Online and Grants Online. So how do I work out who we might approach? It's really worth taking the trouble and time to search and screen your prospects, your potential supporters. There's no point going to a funder that isn't going to be interested in your project. And there are ways to organise and go forward with your grants fundraising work. It can take quite a lot of time to actually not only do the application, but also you do need to be aware that the turnaround time on grants can be anything from 6 months to 18 months. So do factor in a sort of 6 to 12 month window before you might hear back from trusts and foundations. Some of that is because the time it will take you to put together your list of trusts. Some of that is because the time it will take for you to put forward your project. And some of that is the trust and funders' own processes. So a few tips here. Do have a look at making a shortlist. Some funders welcome inquiries. It is, after all, why they're there. They want to support you. So some funders will welcome you calling them to clarify your eligibility. If they don't take inquiries, please don't contact them, because it'll just be a waste of your and their time. And do make a list of who you're going to support. Put it into a spreadsheet or a grid so you know exactly who is going to go to which funder and when the application has been submitted. This is particularly important where you've got several people working on fundraising for your church. So I hope that this presentation has given you some encouragement to continuing fundraising during COVID-19. We've focused on 3 key questions. With social distancing still in place, how can we fundraise? How do we keep our donors involved and up to date? And what are the routes to raise funds when we can't raise them from people that we see directly? And we've looked at some practical things that you can action straight away. Firstly, how to put together a case for support. Secondly, how to keep donors involved, thinking about digital fundraising, and applying and researching grant funding. I hope that that was a useful overview of all the opportunities there are out there for churches to fundraise, even during these extraordinary times. Thank you to those of you who sent in questions, both during the webinar and indeed previously. Really appreciate all those coming in, and there have been lots of them. So I'm going to try and take them and respond to them in the moment. Firstly, we've received lots of questions about the future of funding and what grant makers are thinking during COVID-19. And particularly grateful to have those questions from St Mary's Primrose Hill and indeed from Leicester Cathedral, so 2 quite different churches. And both of you asked, how are grant makers responding during COVID-19? Really pertinent question. And I think the answer is that grant makers, just like the rest of us, have been extraordinarily affected. Of course, everybody's working from home. Actually, people have had to respond very quickly. And I think it's heartwarming how quickly grant makers have responded to the need in our communities. So 2 important points about that. One is that a large number of grant makers have launched new emergency funding opportunities for COVID-19, some of which you've heard about today, and which more details of those are available because we have done with Ecclesiastical a list of grant makers that is available on the Ecclesiastical website through the fundraising hub. So there is a very useful list of grant makers that you can go to. Somebody else has asked us, or a number of people have asked us, if the lead times are the same for those grant makers. Remember that many trust and foundation approaches might take 6 to 12 months to actually see through. But in this emergency, grant makers are responding more quickly. Many of the application processes are much lighter touch than they might be in normal times. And it is worth looking to see what opportunities there are. So the answer is yes, grant makers have responded quite quickly, particularly for those grants to do with activities in the community, as you'd expect, particularly for those grants to do with addressing need in local communities. And please do take a look at those through the fundraising hub. We've also had some questions about digital giving, and a number of you have asked us about that, including St Leonard's in Hatfield, the Church of Holyrood in Nottinghamshire, and of course, particularly now we're all living on Zoom and on other platforms, digital giving is very much a part of our lives and very much a part of your fundraising. Through whether it's through social media, whether it's through giving platforms, or whether it's through face-to-face meetings on Zoom when you can't actually see people. Again, I mean, there is something around this coming up. We're actually running a webinar on digital fundraising and on how to make the most of digital platforms such as Just Giving and others. So please do look out for that, because clearly digital giving is very much part of today's fundraising. Interestingly, we've had quite a few questions from people about why, when so many people are suffering, people would actually support your church. And we've had those from Christchurch, Radlett, St Albans, and from All Saints Streatley in Lichfield, and indeed from some others. Why should people support us at a time when there is so much need in the community? And the answer to this is partly in telling your story, in setting out your case for support, in saying why you need those funds and the difference you're making to people. And we are able to, through the Fundraising Hub, there is a case for support guidance document that is available, and it's also available via the fundraising helpline. And you can also have a discussion with a follow-up discussion, if you like, with a church insurance consultant who can help you with some of this information. So the answer to why should people support us is because you're doing good work, and actually communicating that work that you're doing and the difference it makes in your community is crucial. I was really intrigued to see that a number of people have asked questions about what to do when a lot of your community, a lot of your congregation are not online, are not running their lives on video calls and so on, and what on earth can be done. And a number of these questions came in, including from St Edward the Confessor in Nottingham, thank you very much for that, and Southwark Diocese and some others. And I think the answers to this are to a certain extent common sense and perhaps a bit old-fashioned. If you can't communicate with people digitally, then it's best to resort to the old-fashioned ways of communications. So, for example, a telephone call with people to talk to them about what you're doing with your church fundraising. Obviously a letter, or something that actually is still very powerful, even in today's email culture. And the other thing that works incredibly well is to actually put up posters on your village notice board or in your church porch. And there is a downloadable poster, again, through the Fundraising Hub, which might be useful for you to use, just to tell people that your fundraising is still going on, as I've mentioned in the webinar. I'm just going to check to see what other questions have come in during this session as well, because I believe the number of people are actually emailing them in as we speak. So let me just check what else has come in. Yes, I've got an interesting one here about what you can do if you're struggling to pay for your basic costs, your parish share, and can you fundraise for those? And of course, the straight answer is whatever you're fundraising for must be spent on whatever you've asked for. So it's unusual to fundraise for the parish share, but if you can pay that by some other means, and perhaps fundraising for one of your programs or fundraising for other support, then that is entirely acceptable. But of course, whatever you say you're raising funds for must be what the funds are spent on, both ethically and morally. I think that pretty much covers your questions, but I hope this has been a useful session for you. There are lots of opportunities for churches to fundraise, and I hope it's at least given you some encouragement to carry on with the efforts that you've made so far, or perhaps even to launch new ones. So thank you very much for your attention and indeed for your questions. And I'm going to hand back to Michael now to close us off.
Caroline, thank you so much for sharing all that information with us as churches continue the challenge of fundraising. And thank you all to you in the audience for your questions, which were most insightful and helpful in taking the debate forward. We hope you found the session helpful and will give you practical guidance and support as you go forward with fundraising. To assist, we're setting up a dedicated fundraising helpline which will be manned by our church insurance consultants, who will be really delighted to hear from you and try and help you take things forward. So all it remains for me is to thank you for taking the time to join us, to listen, to ask your questions, and to wish you every success going forward with your fundraising. And finally, just to say goodbye and all stay safe. Thank you.